I'm going to show you a picture and in 3 seconds, try to figure out what it is. You're probably thinking this is a cute looking dog. Well, you're partly right, but what this animal is known for is not being cute. It's known for being the reason behind the longest fence in the world. In fact, the Dingo Fence is almost twice as long as the Mexico border. How did an animal that's about half the size of your average golden retriever make Australians spend 8 years building a fence that's about 5,614 km long over 135 years ago? Australia is quite a weird place. It has spiders that are big enough to eat birds. There are 25 venomous snakes in the world and 21 of them are in Australia. In fact, they have about 10 to 13 tornadoes a season. With all these creepy stats and creatures, Australia has one of the greatest natural tragedies, which has to be the dingo dog. To fully understand why and how the dingo dog tragedy happened, we have to go back in time, and I mean way back in time to over 185 million years ago. You see, there was a time when most of the Earth's landmass was together before they split up to the continents we know today. During the continental drift, Australia acted like a socially awkward teenager at a party and left way too early before the rest of its counterparts. This means Australia spent millions of years on its own, far away from every other landmass, which made its biome so unique that 90% of the wildlife in Australia didn't exist anywhere. Australia was an untouched, unique and highly fragile ecosystem for millions of years, until the year 1770, when the men who loved to wear makeup, wigs and heels made Australia their own colony. In 1770, the British planted their flag on Australian soil and claimed it as theirs. The British naval captain James Cook led his men to Australian soil. They had a reasonable meeting with the natives and paid for the land they claimed.
Wait a minute!
If you find that shocking, that's because it's 100% false. The Westerners claimed Australian soil the same way they claimed almost every piece of land they own, which is by genocide. After the British committed dozens of crimes against humanity on the Australian natives, who had been living there for over 70,000 years, to secure Australian turf, they had an idea to make Australia more like their home. This marked the beginning of one of the worst man-made disasters that would ever happen in nature. That decision alone is responsible for the extinction of over 1 million different species of wildlife. What the British failed to understand was that Mother Nature is a lot like Thanos. She likes everything perfectly balanced. Wildlife is extremely delicate. It consists of millions of different animals eating and being eaten by each other. And the slightest change to that can lead to the extinction of majority of the wildlife. Everyone knows the British love tea. And with the number of British people in Australia increasing, the number of tea being consumed in Australia increased, which simultaneously increased the demand for sugar. So we can already guess what's next in line. Of course, the British started growing sugar. But while doing so, they encountered a tiny problem. A problem that was about 0.19 inches small, but was causing big problems. The problem was the grey-back beetle, which was eating up more than 50% of the sugar plants. The European people had a great idea, which was to solve the problem that was caused by bringing a foreign plant to a fragile ecosystem. They planned to do this by going all the way to Hawaii and importing a foreign animal to this already delicate ecosystem. If you're thinking that's a horrible plan, you're right, because the Europeans imported frogs from Hawaii to eat the beetles. But there arose yet another problem. No animal in Australia was eating the frogs, so the frog population skyrocketed and negatively affected the Australian wildlife structure. And that effect is still felt today over 135 years after. However, the beginning of the dingo fence happened when the Europeans started rearing sheep in Australia. You see, the dingo animals are like wild, prehistoric dogs, and before the sheep came, they used to hunt kangaroos to feed themselves. But now with the import of sheep, the dingoes had to choose between hunting a feisty animal that likes to punch and has the jumping ability of an NBA player, or a meaty and slow animal whose defense mechanism is covering itself with a Christmas sweater. Well, obviously the dingoes chose the latter. The Europeans didn't like the dingoes killing their sheep and livestock because they were simultaneously killing their profits. The sheep and wildlife stock is a huge business. In the year 2020, the dingo face alone made $3 billion a year on sheep exports and $8 billion on cow exports. The Europeans and the Australian sheep farmers decided to solve their dingo problem the same way Donald Trump tried to solve the immigration problem.
We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built.
They decided to build a demarcation, and this demarcation was one of a kind. They built the longest fence in the world, which we all know as the Dingo Fence. Although the fence is named after the dingo, it's probably the worst place to be if you are a dingo, because dingoes are killed on sight when seen anywhere around the fence. The farmers even tie the dead body of the dogs on the fence to send a message to the other dogs. The dingo fence was created to keep sheep safe, but ironically, it has done quite the opposite. Like I said earlier, the nature of wildlife biomes is very delicate. Introducing or reducing the slightest amount of a species can have a domino effect on all the wildlife altogether. Ever since the erection of the fence, dingoes have been hunted down at an alarming rate, thereby reducing their population. Dingoes are the natural predators of kangaroos, and when there aren't enough dingoes around to curb the kangaroos, their population skyrockets. Kangaroos are herbivores that consume a large amount of vegetation, and when they become high in number, the amount of vegetation drastically reduces, making smaller animals unable to feed and die off. The dingo fence was made roughly 135 years ago, and Australia has the highest record of extinct mammals for the last 200 years. That's obviously no coincidence. Science has confirmed that the dingo fence harms the ecosystem. The University of New South Wales studied the satellite images of over 30 years on the dingo fence and realized that vegetation and wildlife are booming on the side of the fence where the dingoes aren't being killed, but there is drastic deforestation on the side where dingoes aren't present. If it has been proven scientifically that the dingo being hunted down drastically is horrible for the Australian environment, why is the dingo fence still up, with even plans to extend the dingo fence in some areas? Well, it's the same reason why humans cut down trees, even though we are facing huge deforestation. It's the same reason humans burn greenhouse gases when the ozone layer is depleting at an alarming rate. That reason is greed. The dingo fence probably helps generate over $12 billion a year alone, and it costs just $8 million a year to maintain. The dingo fence represents one of the many times we humans have damaged the delicate balance of nature, all for our own needs, completely disregarding the well-being of every other plant or animal. That fence alone has damaged an ecosystem that has been untouched for over 200 million years in just barely 2 centuries. This further proves why wildlife conservation is so important and why we as humans need to protect and respect the natural balance of nature. We should put aside our cravings for making money and put our planet first, because it is literally all we have.